The next item of business this afternoon is topical questions. Question number 1, Jim Hume.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on a recent study that indicates that the reduction in staffed hospital beds in Scotland is happening at one of the fastest rates in the developed world.
Cabinet Secretary Alex Neil.
Presiding Officer, care patterns have changed over the years, with more care delivered in the community, shorter hospital stays and more same-day surgery without the need for any overnight stay, which is good for patients. Comparing the Scottish figures with those produced by the Office for Economic Data shows that the rate of reduction in beds in Scotland is actually slower than the UK rate. Furthermore, Scotland has more beds per head of the population than approximately half the countries included in the OECD analysis. The number of staff beds varies throughout the year to reflect service use. The most recent official statistics demonstrate that there has been an increase of 183 acute beds over the last year or so. We are not complacent. That's why we are developing an evidence-based bed planning toolkit to ensure we have the right number, mix and use of beds across Scotland.
Mr Hume.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but the reality is, though, that the Government's own figures have shown that they've presided over a staggering decline in hospital beds that, when compared against the OECD study, surpasses nearly every other developed nation on earth. The Cabinet Secretary claims that the delivery of more care in the community and shorter hospital stays has allowed the Scottish Government to reduce the number of available beds. But does he not accept that the intolerable pressure placed upon the NHS and its hard-working staff, and highlighted by Dr Dewhurst earlier this year, is as a result of decisions made by this Government? Decisions such as cutting thousands of staff beds.
Can we just get to the question, Mr Hume?
Shorter stays because someone's already waiting on a trolley or waiting room to fill that bed.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, if you look over the last 10 years, there have been major developments in the National Health Service which I believed every party was signed up to. One of them was to transfer care for mentally ill people out of the hospital situation as much as possible and into the community. And let me quote my predecessor, Andy Kerr, when he was Health Minister, and I think Andy Kerr summed it up beautifully, when he said there are good reasons for reductions in acute bed numbers. Medical advances continue to reduce lengths of stay associated with many planned procedures, and some are now routinely carried out in a few hours without the need for any overnight stay. So a reduction in bed numbers is a reflection of medical advance. I do accept there are some areas where there have been pressures, where the number of beds has been reduced too quickly, and in those situations we've reinstated beds, and I'll give you the example of Fife, for example, where 20 beds were reinstated recently. And of course, Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. There is no doubt there has been a strategic shortage of beds in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary because there was a 20% gap between the forecast population of Edinburgh when the Royal Infirmary was planned 10-12 years ago and the actual increase in the population since. And steps have been taken to rectify that strategic shortage, which is a shortage that we inherited.
Briefly, Mr Hume.
Yeah, the Cabinet Secretary has been this Government's been in charge for 7 years now, and it was only 16 months ago that some 1,500 patients in 1 month alone spent over 8 hours in accident and emergency. Does the Cabinet Secretary not agree that hospital beds disappearing at a faster rate than almost any other country in this developed world is a cut too far, and the sticking plaster approach to tackling problems in our NHS is simply not working?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as we've made clear, the problem with some people waiting too long after the decision's been taken to admit them after they've been in A&E has been due to the flow of patients rather than any strategic shortage in the number of beds. For example, in many hospitals, the percentage of patients being discharged in any day up till about noon, only 6% of the daily discharge were discharged before noon. We've now increased that to, say, 25%. And that has allowed the flow of patients to be improved dramatically. So very often these issues are about the flow of patients rather than about any strategic shortage of beds. Where there has been a strategic shortage of beds, we've taken steps to address that.
Neil Findlay.
Presiding Officer, after months of denial, we are now seeing the extent of the pressures on the NHS staff and the services they provide fully exposed. We have bed blocking 130 in this city alone, fewer staff, increasing demand, a social care crisis, all within a system that has 6,000 fewer beds available. Will the Cabinet Secretary now accept that what we need is a full, independent and comprehensive review of the NHS in Scotland to ensure that it is fully staffed and equipped to meet the needs and demands of the 21st century?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the reason Mr Finlay wants a review is because he has no policy and no vision for the National Health Service in Scotland. And in relation to the number of beds, let me quote his colleague, Richard Simpson, who said in 2011, "I welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary," who was Nicola Sturgeon at the time, "has dropped some of the pledges that were made in the SNP manifesto of 2007, which were not appropriate. One example was not reducing the number of acute beds. The Cabinet Secretary has now dropped that target, which is correct. If we can shift the balance of care, it could result in a reduction in the number of acute beds." So Labour should really get their act together between their spokesman and their junior spokesman on this issue.
Dr Simpson.
I think it's pretty ripe, actually, saying there's a division between Neil Finlay and myself. That doesn't exist. The point we're trying to make is that in 2005 to 2007, the then spokesperson for your party spent 2 years attacking us for reducing bed numbers. You then made a manifesto pledge in 2007 that you wouldn't reduce bed numbers, and you didn't, over the next 4 years, actually deal with that. Now, if we're going to have a mature debate, which I thought we'd started, then we have to stop actually attacking each other on the basis of the way we were before. But a starting point for that, Cabinet Secretary, is will you now accept that the attacks your party was making on our party when Andy Kerr was in charge were inappropriate, and your pledge in 2007 was inappropriate? Because that is the starting point for us then agreeing on what appropriate bed numbers might be, reflecting all the things you've quite correctly talked about.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say the starting point for trying to get a consensus is neither the kind of ridiculous remarks made by Neil Finlay or trying to rewrite history. Let us concentrate on the future. And the future, I think, which we're all agreed on, is to shift care into the community, into homes, or into homes in a community setting. That is the future of 21st century health. That is why the number of community nurses has been increased by 30%. That is why we've got integration of adult health and social care. That is why we're shifting resources into the primary care sector. Now, my understanding was that the Labour Party agreed with that strategy, as does the Conservative Party, and I was under the impression the Liberal Party. But you cannot, on the one hand, sign up to a strategy to shift the emphasis into the community and then make a song and dance because of a reduction in the number of acute beds. If you have shorter stays, if you have mental health services delivered in the community, if you have at your core the strategy of treating people in the community instead of in hospital, by definition, you're not going to need the same number of acute beds. That goes without saying, and I think people should be honest about the implications of following the strategy, which I believe we had a consensus on.
Thank you. We now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 9836, in the name of Richard Lochhead, on inshore fisheries. Members who wish to take part in